In the early part of the 18th century, most people in England lived in much the same way their grandparents had, and their grandparents before them. Villages were quiet places, settled into the rhythms of the seasons. People woke with the light and rested when it faded. The fields around them were tended by hand, the grain cut slowly with scythes, the hay gathered and stacked in the warm months and left to sustain the animals through the cold ones. Life moved at the pace of nature, and most people had never traveled more than a few miles from the place where they were born. The towns that existed were not large by any modern measure. Even the busiest market towns were places where you might know the faces of most people you passed on the street. Trade happened in open squares, where farmers brought their vegetables and weavers displayed their cloth. A blacksmith's shop might sit at the edge of the square, its fire glowing quietly through an open door. A baker would rise before dawn to have bread ready by morning. These were the shapes of ordinary life, and they had been the shapes of ordinary life for generations beyond counting. The land itself was the center of everything. Families who had worked the same fields for 100 years continued to do so, not because they were forced to remain, but because the land was what they knew. It provided food, and it provided a kind of identity. The turning of the seasons gave structure to the year, and the harvest was the great shared effort that drew whole communities together. After the harvest came festivals, and a kind of collective exhale, a sense that the year's most important work had been done. Craftspeople worked in their homes or in small workshops attached to their homes. A weaver might have a loom set up in a back room, and the sound of the shuttle passing back and forth through the threads would be a constant background presence in the household, as familiar as the sound of the wind or the fire. Cloth was produced slowly, piece by piece, by hands that had been trained to the work since childhood. The quality of what was made depended entirely on the skill of the person making it, and skill was something that accumulated quietly over years and decades. Iron was worked in small forges scattered across the countryside, often near streams whose flowing water could power the bellows. These operations were modest, producing tools and hardware for local use, nails and plowshares and hinges. Coal was mined in certain regions, but only in relatively small amounts, and its use was still limited mostly to heating homes and supplying a handful of specialized trades. The idea that coal might one day transform the entire world had not yet formed in anyone's mind. It was in this unhurried landscape that something began, very gradually, to shift. The shift did not happen all at once. It did not begin on a particular morning or with a single decision. It crept in slowly, the way a change in weather moves across a country, arriving first in one corner and then spreading, almost imperceptibly, across everything. The first signs were technical, and they appeared in the textile trade. Weavers and spinners had always worked by hand, producing thread and cloth at the natural pace that human fingers allowed. The demand for cloth had been growing, driven by a growing population and by trade with other parts of the world, and that growing demand put pressure on the traditional ways of making things. A few inventors and craftsmen began experimenting with ways to speed up the work. The results, at first, were modest. A device here or there that could spin a little faster, a loom that could be operated slightly more efficiently. But each small improvement suggested the possibility of another. The spinning jenny, invented in the 1760s, allowed a single spinner to work with multiple spindles at once. It was a wooden device, operated by hand, and in its earliest forms it was not dramatically different from the tools that had come before. But it meant that more thread could be produced in the same amount of time, and that mattered. Other inventions followed, each one building on what had come before. The water frame and the spinning mule came along within years of each other, and suddenly the production of thread was happening at a speed that would have seemed almost impossible to an earlier generation. Water was the first great power source for these new machines. Mills were built along rivers, their large wooden wheels turning in the current, and that turning motion was transmitted through wooden gears and shafts to drive the machinery inside. Mill buildings were simple stone structures, practical and without ornament, set close to the water that powered them. The sound inside was rhythmic, the clatter and thud of machinery working, a sound that would have been unfamiliar to most people of that era, who were accustomed only to the sounds of human and animal effort. The workers in these early mills were often entire families. Children worked alongside their parents, as they had always done on farms and in cottage industries. The work was different, though. Instead of varying with the seasons, it was constant. Instead of happening at the pace of individual judgment, it was set by the machines themselves. A worker at a spinning frame had to keep pace with the frame, not with their own natural rhythm. This was a subtle but significant change, a shift in the relationship between people and their work that would deepen over the decades to come. The villages near the early mills grew slowly. Workers needed places to live, and small rows of cottages were built close to the mill buildings. These were plain structures, their rooms modest, their gardens small. But they represented something new, housing built not around the land, not near the fields, but near the machinery. The geography of where people lived was beginning to be shaped by forces other than agriculture. The rivers that powered the early mills were not always reliable. Droughts could slow or stop them in summer. Floods could damage the wheels and machinery. And the most promising locations were not always near the places where workers or raw materials were most available. Something more dependable was needed, something that could work regardless of season or location. Steam had been understood as a force for centuries. People had known that boiling water produced pressure, and that this pressure could do work. But turning that understanding into something practical and reliable was another matter. The early steam engines of the early 18th century were enormous, inefficient machines, used mainly for pumping water out of mines. They consumed tremendous amounts of coal to produce relatively small amounts of work. They were not, at first, thought of as general-purpose power sources. They were specialized tools for a specific problem. James Watt, a Scottish instrument maker working at the University of Glasgow in the 1760s, was asked to repair a model of one of these early engines. In studying it, he noticed the fundamental inefficiency in its design, the way heat was being wasted with each cycle of the machine. He spent years working on improvements, and the engine he eventually developed was substantially more efficient than anything that had come before. His key innovation was the separate condenser, which allowed the main cylinder to remain hot while the steam was cooled elsewhere. The result was an engine that used far less fuel to do the same amount of work. Watt's improvements did not happen quickly. They took years of careful work, of small adjustments and reconsiderations, of collaboration with a manufacturer named Matthew Boulton, who provided the financial support and practical expertise that were necessary to bring the improved engine into production. The partnership between Watt and Boulton lasted for decades, and the engines they produced together were installed in mines and mills across Britain, gradually demonstrating that steam could be a reliable, flexible source of power. As the 18th century moved toward its close, steam engines were becoming more common. They were still large and expensive, and operating them required skill and attention. But they were working, doing real work, pumping water, and driving machinery in ways that would have required many more human or animal hands before. The landscape around the coal mines of the north of England and the Midlands was beginning to take on a different character, with engine houses rising above the ground, their chimneys sending up slow columns of smoke into the grey sky. The coal that fed the steam engines had to be moved from the places where it was mined to the places where it was needed. Roads in 18th century England were often poor, deeply rutted by heavy wagons and made difficult by rain and frost. Moving heavy loads of coal by road was slow and expensive. Canals offered a better option. A barge on a canal could carry many times more than a horse-drawn wagon on a road, and could do so more smoothly and for less effort. Canal building in England began in earnest in the 1760s and continued for several decades. These were remarkable engineering projects, requiring surveys, earth moving, the construction of locks to manage differences in elevation, and the digging of tunnels through hills that could not be avoided. The people who dug the canals by hand, working with shovels and wheelbarrows, were known as navigators, a word that would later be shortened to navvies. They moved from project to project, following the work, living in temporary camps near the construction sites. The canals, when they were finished, were peaceful corridors through the landscape. Narrow boats moved along them at walking pace, pulled by horses on the towpath. They carried coal and limestone, pottery and grain, the slow-moving goods of an industrializing economy. Villages along the canals became small centers of activity, with warehouses and repair yards and inns that served the boat crews. The canal network connected different parts of the country in ways that had not been possible before, and allowed goods to be moved more cheaply and reliably than at any earlier time. Towns grew near the junctions of canals and near the coal and iron fields. Manchester, in the northwest of England, began to grow quickly as cotton mills multiplied along the rivers and canals of the region. Its population, which had been modest at the start of the 18th century, began to climb steadily. New streets were laid out, new buildings constructed, new populations arrived from the surrounding countryside and from further away. The pace of change was slow enough that it was not always apparent to those living through it, but it was persistent, and over the decades the transformation accumulated into something unmistakable. Birmingham, in the West Midlands, grew as a centre of metalworking and manufacturing. It was a city of small workshops rather than large factories, where skilled craftsmen made everything from guns to buttons to scientific instruments. The noise of hammer and file was its constant background music. Its streets were not particularly orderly, and its buildings varied widely in size and condition, but it was full of energy and activity, a place where making things was the central fact of existence. The cities that grew during this period were shaped by the forces that had created them. They were not planned in any comprehensive way. Streets appeared where they were needed, buildings went up where land was available, workshops and houses occupied the same neighborhoods, sometimes the same buildings. The wealthy and the poor lived in proximity that would later seem remarkable, though in different conditions. A factory owner might have a comfortable house on a respectable street not far from the rows of workers' cottages that crowded close to the mill. A Victorian city at night would have been a place of unusual sounds and smells to a modern visitor. The streets were lit by gas lamps, their yellow flames casting a soft, unsteady light over the cobblestones. The smell of coal smoke was omnipresent, drifting from thousands of domestic chimneys and from the larger chimneys of mills and factories. The streets themselves would have been quieter than modern streets after dark, with most of the heavy traffic having ceased, and only foot passengers and the occasional carriage moving through the lamplight. The gas that lit the streets and, increasingly, the interiors of homes and shops was itself a product of the new industrial processes. Coal gas was produced by heating coal in sealed containers, capturing the gas that was released, and piping it through underground mains to customers. The gas companies that operated these networks were among the first large-scale utilities, organizations that existed to provide a continuous service to many customers across a city. Installing a gas main beneath a city street required digging up the cobblestones, laying iron pipes, and then resurfacing everything again. It was disruptive and expensive, but the result, reliable artificial light available at the turn of a tap, was something that changed the texture of daily life in ways that are easy to underestimate. Before gas lighting, the primary sources of artificial light were candles and oil lamps. Both were expensive relative to their output, and the light they produced was modest. A room lit by candles was a dim place by modern standards, and tasks that required fine vision, like reading, writing, or sewing, were tiring to perform in such conditions. Gas light was brighter and steadier, and while it had its own characteristics and its own limitations, it genuinely extended the usable hours of the day for those who had access to it. The working day in a textile mill during the early industrial period was long. Workers, including children, might begin before dawn and continue until after dark, with short breaks for meals. The factory clock governed the day in a way that was different from anything that had come before. On a farm, the pace of work could vary with the season, with the weather, with the judgment of those doing the work. In a mill, the machinery ran at a fixed pace and the workers ran with it. The discipline of factory work was a new kind of discipline, one that was experienced as quite different from the older patterns of agricultural labor. The factory buildings themselves were functional structures, built to contain machinery and workers as efficiently as possible. The early mills were often several stories tall, their floors connected by wooden staircases, their large windows designed to admit as much light as possible in the days before artificial lighting was widely available. The ceilings were low, and the space between the machines was narrow. The noise inside was constant and loud, the sound of cotton carding and spinning and the thud of the looms. Workers communicated through gesture and lip reading as much as through spoken words. The managers of these early factories faced problems that no one had faced before in quite the same way. How do you organize the labor of dozens or hundreds of workers, all of whom need to do different tasks in a coordinated way? How do you ensure that machinery is maintained and that work continues reliably? The solutions that emerged were practical ones, based on observation and experience rather than theory. Foremen watched over sections of the mill, ensuring that work was proceeding properly. Wages were paid weekly, and fines were deducted for poor work or lateness. Written records began to be kept of hours worked and goods produced. The products of the mills flowed out through the canal network to ports, and from ports to markets around the world. British cotton cloth was being sold in markets that earlier generations of English weavers could never have imagined reaching. The sheer quantity of cloth being produced, and the speed at which it was being produced, was transforming the economics of the trade. Cloth that had once been expensive became cheaper. This was good for those who bought cloth, but it put pressure on those who had made cloth by hand in the traditional way. The cottage weavers, who had supplemented their agricultural income with hand weaving, found that the mills could produce cloth more cheaply than they could. The displacement of older ways of working by new machinery was not painless. Skilled handloom weavers who had spent years mastering their craft found that their skills were worth less than they had been. Some adapted, finding work in the mills or in other trades. Some moved to towns in search of other opportunities. Some experienced real hardship. The process of economic change, even when it is eventually beneficial in aggregate, does not distribute its benefits and costs evenly, and the workers of the early industrial period lived through this unevenly. The towns that housed the growing industrial workforce were not always comfortable places to live. Housing was built quickly to accommodate rapidly expanding populations, and speed and economy were often prioritized over quality. Back-to-back houses, where one row of houses shared a rear wall with the next row, were common in the mill towns of northern England. These houses had no rear ventilation, and their yards were small. Courts and alleys ran between the rows, narrow passages that admitted little light or air. Water came from wells or standpipes shared among many households. The arrangements for disposing of waste were inadequate for the density of population that had accumulated. Illness was common in these conditions. The connection between contaminated water and cholera was not understood until the middle of the 19th century, and even after it was demonstrated, improvements to water supply and sewage systems took time and money that were not always available. Typhoid and tuberculosis were familiar presences in working-class neighborhoods. Life expectancy in the industrial towns was lower than in the countryside, a fact that troubled those who noticed it, though it was not always easy to know what to do about it. And yet, for all its difficulties, life in the industrial towns was not without its pleasures and its textures. The close proximity of neighbors created communities of considerable intensity. People knew each other's business, helped each other in difficulty, celebrated together and mourned together. The pub at the end of the row served as a kind of community center, a place where news was shared and conversations could range widely. Street markets were lively places on weekend mornings, where food and second-hand goods could be bought, and where the social life of the neighborhood was visible and audible. The calendar of the industrial town was marked by fewer of the agricultural festivals that had punctuated the older rural year, but it was not without its own celebrations. Wakes weeks, the traditional holidays tied to the feast days of local churches, persisted and evolved into secular occasions. Whole mill towns would close for a few days in summer and travel to the seaside, a journey made possible by the railways as they developed. The seaside resorts of the northwest of England, Blackpool most famously, grew substantially because of the annual migrations of mill workers seeking a few days of salt air and distance from the usual routine. The railways, when they came, were the most dramatic transformation of the landscape since the enclosure of the common fields. Building a railway required far more engineering effort than building a canal. Gradients had to be controlled, which meant cutting through hills and building embankments across valleys. Bridges had to be constructed over rivers and roads. The scale of earthworks required was enormous, and the armies of navvies who built them moved through the landscape like a slow wave, transforming everything they touched. The first railways were built to move coal from mines to rivers or canals, and they used horses rather than steam engines to pull the wagons along the rails. The rails themselves were simply a smooth surface that reduced friction and made it easier for horses to pull heavy loads. The improvement over an unpaved road was significant even without any new source of power. But the possibility of using steam engines to replace the horses was present from the beginning, and experiments in this direction began as soon as the technology seemed to permit it. George Stephenson was a self-educated colliery engineer from Northumberland who had spent years learning about steam engines and how they worked. His first locomotives were built for use at the collieries where he worked, pulling wagons of coal along the short rail lines that connected the mine workings to the loading points. They were slow and ungainly machines, prone to breakdowns, but they worked, and Stephenson learned from each one he built. His son Robert, who had received the formal education that his father had lacked, joined him in this work, and together they developed the technology through the 1820s. The Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opened in 1825, was primarily designed to move coal but also carried passengers. It used a combination of steam locomotives and horse-drawn wagons, and was significant mainly as a demonstration that the concept worked at a larger scale. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which followed 5 years later, was more ambitious in every way. It was built to carry both goods and passengers between two major cities. It required substantial engineering works including a long cutting through rock and an embankment across a stretch of boggy moorland, and it was intended from the start to use steam power throughout. The opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830 was one of those moments that seemed to signal something genuinely new. The railway worked. The locomotives pulled their carriages at speeds that had never been achieved before in the history of land transportation. The journey that had taken a day by road or canal could now be completed in a couple of hours. People who experienced it for the first time often described a particular sensation of the landscape rushing past, a visual experience entirely unlike anything they had known. The world had not changed, but the human relationship to distance and time had changed, subtly but permanently. Railways spread across Britain with remarkable speed through the 1830s and 1840s. The appetite for investment was enormous, and companies formed to build lines connecting every city of any significance. The railway mania of the mid-1840s saw a period of speculative building where investors poured money into railway schemes, some of which were well conceived and others of which were not. Many investors lost money when the bubble deflated, but the physical infrastructure that was built remained, and the network that emerged by the 1850s was the foundation for everything that followed. The experience of railway travel was a new kind of experience. The trains ran in enclosed compartments, their upholstered seats covered in dark cloth, their small windows offering framed views of the countryside or the town. The sound was a rhythmic clicking of wheels on rail joints, punctuated by the occasional whistle and the rush of air when passing through a tunnel. Stations were designed to be impressive, their vaulted iron and glass roofs creating spaces unlike anything that had previously existed in architecture, vast covered volumes that admitted light while sheltering thousands of people and dozens of trains. The large railway termini in London and the other major cities became landmarks, their facades often elaborately decorated in whatever architectural style was fashionable at the time. Behind the decorative facades were the functional train sheds, enormous iron structures that were engineering achievements in their own right. The combination of the ornate and the industrial was characteristic of much Victorian building, a desire to assert that the new world of machinery was compatible with, or even an expression of, civilization and culture. The iron that built the railways and the factories and the bridges and the ships came from foundries and ironworks concentrated in particular regions. The valleys of South Wales, the northeast of England, and parts of Scotland were transformed by the iron and steel industries. The smelting of iron required large quantities of coke, which was produced from coal, and the works that produced iron were typically located near coalfields for this reason. The landscape around a large ironworks at night was an extraordinary sight, the glow of the furnaces visible for miles, the sky above flickering with reflected light. The ironmasters who built and operated these works were a new kind of businessmen, dealing in quantities and scales that had been simply inconceivable a generation earlier. They employed hundreds or thousands of workers, managed complex logistics of raw material supply and finished product distribution, and invested in the machinery and infrastructure their operations required. Some of them were immigrants from other parts of Britain or from other countries, drawn to the expanding economy of the industrial regions. Others were local men who had found their way into the trade through skill and persistence. The workers in the iron and steel industries did work that was physically demanding and that required skill that accumulated over years. Puddlers, who worked molten iron with long rods to remove impurities, had to develop the strength and endurance to work in extreme heat for hours at a time. They were among the better-paid industrial workers of their era, because what they did was genuinely difficult to learn and difficult to sustain. Even so, the physical toll of the work was considerable, and the careers of puddlers were often shortened by the effects of sustained exposure to heat and physical strain. Alongside the factories and foundries, other industries were growing that were less dramatic but equally important. The pottery industry in Staffordshire, concentrated around the town of Stoke-on-Trent, produced enormous quantities of earthenware and china for domestic use. The area had the necessary combination of clay, coal for firing, and water for the manufacturing processes, and the canal network allowed its products to reach markets across the country. The names associated with the industry, Wedgwood most famously, built businesses that combined manufacturing efficiency with careful attention to design and quality. Josiah Wedgwood is an interesting figure from this period precisely because he represented a way of thinking about manufacture that was more deliberate and systematic than was typical of his era. He kept careful records of his experiments with clay bodies and glazes. He thought carefully about the design of his products and how they would appeal to customers. He organized his factory with an attention to the flow of work and the division of labor that anticipated approaches that would become more common later. He also understood that the reputation of his brand mattered, and he cultivated relationships with influential customers who could lend prestige to his products. The growth of towns and cities created a growing market for all kinds of goods. A family that moved from a village to a mill town might find itself needing to purchase things that would previously have been made at home or traded informally among neighbors. Food that had come from the kitchen garden or from keeping a pig now had to be bought from shops. Clothing that had been made from homespun cloth or repaired indefinitely now was more likely to be purchased ready-made. The market economy, in which goods and services were exchanged for money, penetrated more deeply into daily life than it had done in the predominantly agricultural past. Shop fronts began to multiply in the high streets of towns, their windows displaying goods in ways designed to attract attention. The art of retail display was in its infancy, but it was present. Grocers arranged their goods carefully, bakers displayed their loaves and pastries, drapers set out their bolts of cloth. The high street was becoming the commercial heart of the Victorian town, a place where shopping was not merely a transaction but a social activity, a way of moving through the public life of the community. The postal service was transformed during this period in a way that deserves mention. Before the reforms of 1840, postage was paid by the recipient rather than the sender, and the cost was based on distance and the number of sheets in a letter, making correspondence expensive and complicated. Rowland Hill's proposal for a uniform penny post, where a letter could be sent anywhere in the country for a single penny, paid in advance by the sender through the use of an adhesive stamp, was adopted in 1840. The result was an immediate and dramatic increase in the volume of mail. People who had previously written letters rarely, because of the cost, began to write regularly. The ability to communicate across distance cheaply and reliably was a modest but genuine improvement in the texture of daily life. The telegraph followed in the 1840s, initially developed as a communication system for the railways, where being able to send messages faster than a train could travel was obviously useful for avoiding collisions and managing traffic. The technology spread quickly, and telegraph offices appeared in railway stations and post offices across the country. A message that had once taken days to travel from London to Edinburgh now arrived in minutes. The compression of communication time was one of the most significant and least remarked changes of the industrial period, gradually making possible forms of economic and social coordination that would have been impossible when information could only travel at the speed of a human messenger. The newspapers of the Victorian period multiplied as literacy increased and as printing technology improved. The steam-powered printing press, which began to appear in the 1810s and 1820s, could produce many more copies of a newspaper in a given time than a hand press could. This reduced the cost of printing and made it practical to produce larger print runs for cheaper papers. The abolition of the stamp duty on newspapers in 1855 removed another barrier, and the press of the second half of the Victorian period was remarkable for its variety and its energy. Local papers in every town reported on local affairs, while the national papers addressed the concerns of a larger readership. The books published during this period were increasingly accessible as well. The circulating libraries that appeared in many towns allowed readers who could not afford to buy books to borrow them for a small fee. The 3-volume novel, the standard format for Victorian fiction, was expensive to buy but widely available through libraries. The serialization of novels in monthly or weekly magazines made long fiction available to readers who might not be able to afford even a library subscription, spreading the stories of Dickens and Trollope and Eliot to audiences far wider than any previous generation of writers had reached. Reading aloud in the home was a common evening activity in households that were literate and that had access to reading material. A family gathered around a lamp while one member read aloud, the others listening while occupied with needlework or other quiet tasks, was a picture that appeared repeatedly in the domestic literature of the period. It combined the educational function of literacy with the social function of family togetherness, and it required nothing more than a book and a lamp. The lamp itself was gradually improving. Whale oil and other animal fats had been the principal fuel for lamps before the industrial period, and they produced a yellowish, somewhat smoky flame. Improvements in lamp design and the introduction of cleaner-burning mineral oils in the middle of the 19th century improved the quality of artificial light available to those who could not yet access gas. Kerosene, which was refined from petroleum, became widely available after mid-century and was both cheaper and cleaner than earlier lamp fuels. By the 1860s, a modest household could have reliable, reasonably bright artificial light for an evening's reading at a cost that was genuinely affordable. The changing nature of work in the industrial period affected men and women differently. In the textile mills, women and children had worked alongside men from the beginning, and women continued to constitute a large proportion of the textile workforce throughout the period. But as the century progressed and as ideas about respectability and domestic life evolved, the expectation that married women of the working class would work outside the home in manufacturing began to be contested, though economic necessity often overrode these expectations. Working-class women might move between paid employment and domestic work depending on circumstances, and the boundaries between the two were not always clear. Middle-class women, in contrast, were increasingly expected to manage the domestic sphere and to refrain from paid employment. The home that a middle-class wife managed was itself a kind of production, the site where meals were prepared, clothing was maintained, children were cared for, and social obligations were fulfilled. Running such a household required real skill and organization, even if it was not recognized as work in the economic sense. The elaboration of domestic life, the emphasis on the well-appointed home with its various rooms for different purposes and its array of household goods, was itself a product of the increasing production of the industrial economy. Servants were employed in middle-class households in numbers that reflected the labor-intensive nature of domestic work before modern appliances. Cooking on coal ranges required constant attention to the fire and to the temperature of various parts of the range. Cleaning in an era of coal smoke and open fires was an ongoing effort. Laundry was an exhausting physical task. The census records of Victorian England reveal a substantial portion of the employed population working as domestic servants, mostly women, mostly young. Going into service was a common trajectory for girls from rural or working-class backgrounds, and while the conditions varied widely, domestic service offered accommodation and relatively stable employment. The middle-class home of the Victorian period was a carefully organized space, its rooms assigned to particular functions in a way that reflected evolving ideas about family life and social propriety. The parlor or drawing room was a formal space for receiving visitors, furnished carefully and kept in a state of readiness for company that might call at any time. The dining room was where the family gathered for meals, the table laid with the appropriate implements for each dish. The kitchen was a working space, not a social one, and in grander houses it was located so as to be largely invisible to the household's social life. The furniture that filled these rooms was often heavy and dark, made of mahogany or walnut, its surfaces decorated with carving. Upholstery was thick and tasseled, patterns were dense, and the overall effect was one of comfort and solidity. The rooms accumulated objects over time: photographs in frames, china figurines, vases, books, souvenirs of travel, the material accumulation of a life lived in one place. This density of objects can seem oppressive from a modern perspective, but it reflected a value placed on permanence and continuity, a desire to surround oneself with the evidence of a life. The gardens attached to middle-class houses were another expression of these values. The Victorian garden was not a wild place but a cultivated one, its beds arranged geometrically, its lawns carefully kept, its borders planted with flowers chosen for their color and form. Gardening was a respectable hobby for both men and women, and the horticultural literature of the period was substantial. The great botanical gardens and parks that were created in Victorian cities were expressions of the same impulse at a larger scale, ordered nature made available to a broad public. The public parks that appeared in Victorian cities were not simply aesthetic amenities. They were also understood as having social and moral functions, places where working people could spend their leisure time in wholesome outdoor pursuits rather than in less desirable alternatives. The movement to provide public open space in industrial cities was energetic and eventually successful, and the parks that were created remain important parts of the urban fabric today. They were designed with care, their paths curving through planted landscapes, their lakes or ponds reflecting the sky, their bandstands and pavilions providing focal points for public gathering. Music was an important part of Victorian social life across all classes. The brass band movement, which developed in the industrial towns of the north of England, gave working men access to musical performance through community bands associated with mills, collieries, and other workplaces. These bands rehearsed regularly and competed against each other in contests that drew large audiences. The discipline of learning to play an instrument and to perform as part of an ensemble was valued for its own sake, as an activity that required attention and practice and cooperation. The piano had become a central fixture of the middle-class drawing room by the Victorian period. Learning to play the piano was a standard part of a girl's education in households that could afford one, and the piano was also an important item of display, a signal of the family's cultural attainment and financial stability. The publishing of sheet music was a significant industry, supplying homes across the country with the latest songs and dances, as well as arrangements of operatic and orchestral music in forms accessible to amateur performers. Choral singing was another widely practiced musical form. Choral societies existed in towns across Britain, their members gathering weekly to rehearse large-scale works for public performance. Handel's oratorios and, later, Mendelssohn's Elijah were standard repertoire items, performed by amateur choirs of hundreds of voices in concert halls and churches throughout the country. The performance of serious choral music by ordinary working and middle-class people was something that distinguished Victorian England from many other musical cultures, and it continued through the period with considerable vitality. The railways that connected the cities of Victorian Britain also made it possible for people to move between cities more easily than before, and this facilitated the development of national markets not only for goods but for cultural products. A theatrical company that in an earlier era might have performed only in London could now tour the provinces, playing in the new theatres and music halls that were being built in every substantial town. The same plays, the same performers, could be seen across the country, creating something like a shared national cultural experience. The music hall was a distinctly Victorian entertainment form, growing out of the saloon entertainments of urban taverns into purpose-built venues that could accommodate hundreds or thousands of people. A music hall evening offered a variety of acts, singers and comedians and acrobats and novelty performers, loosely strung together into a long program that could be entered and exited at any point. The audience was largely working class, and the atmosphere was informal and interactive. Popular songs from the music halls spread through the culture, whistled and sung by people who had heard them at the hall or learned them from others. The photographs of Victorian life that survive give a particular impression of the period, one that is inevitably partial. Photography was a new technology in the Victorian period, and the long exposure times required in its early decades meant that photographs were posed and static. Outdoor scenes were easier to capture than indoor ones, and the subjects of early photographs often have a stiffness about them that reflects the necessity of remaining still. But these images also give access to the physical world of the period in a way that earlier visual records could not, showing the actual faces and clothing and settings of ordinary life with a directness that is still affecting. The Victorian period was one of great self-consciousness about its own nature and significance. The people who lived through it were aware that the world was changing, and this awareness shaped their thinking and their culture. The philosophical and economic ideas that tried to explain and make sense of the changes were numerous and varied, from the classical economics that underpinned free trade policy to the socialist and cooperative movements that sought to organize working people in their own interests. The debates about the role of the state, about the conditions of workers, about the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare, were all energetically conducted throughout the period. The Reform Act of 1832 extended the vote to a larger section of the male population, though it left the majority of men, and all women, still without the franchise. Further reforms followed over the decades, gradually broadening political participation. The political energy of the working class found expression not only in formal politics but in trade unions, cooperative societies, friendly societies, and a range of other organizations that aimed to improve the material conditions of working people through collective action. The Chartist movement of the late 1830s and 1840s was the most dramatic popular political movement of the early industrial period. It called for a set of reforms to the electoral system, including universal male suffrage, the secret ballot, and equal electoral districts, that were considered radical at the time. The movement organized mass meetings and petitions, and attracted support from working people across the country. Its immediate demands were not met, but the issues it raised continued to shape British politics for decades. Factory reform was another area of political contention. The early Factory Acts, which set limits on the working hours of children and, later, of women, were opposed by manufacturers who argued that they would damage the competitiveness of British industry. They were supported by a coalition that cut across the usual political lines, including evangelical philanthropists concerned about the moral welfare of children and paternalistic landowners who resented the power of the new industrial class. The gradual extension of factory legislation over the course of the Victorian period was slow and often hard-won, but it resulted eventually in a substantially improved framework of protection for workers. The Public Health Act of 1848 created the General Board of Health and gave local authorities powers to improve sanitation, though it took the repeated shock of cholera epidemics to generate the political will to act on a large scale. The construction of sewerage systems and the provision of clean water were among the most significant public health interventions of the Victorian period, and they were accomplished through determined effort by engineers and public health campaigners against considerable resistance. The great brick sewers that Edwin Chadwick and Joseph Bazalgette designed for London in the 1850s and 1860s are still largely in use, a practical inheritance from the Victorian period that continues to support the daily life of the city. The gradual improvement of urban conditions over the course of the Victorian period was not uniform or rapid, but it was real. The worst housing was slowly replaced or improved. Water supplies became cleaner. Streets were paved and maintained. Gas and later electric light made cities safer and more comfortable at night. The accumulation of these improvements transformed the experience of urban life, making it progressively less harsh and dangerous, though never without its difficulties and inequalities. The expansion of education was another significant development of the period. In the early industrial era, access to education was limited and uneven. Some children attended church schools or charity schools, others were educated in small private establishments, and many received little formal schooling at all. The Factory Acts that restricted child labor had the effect of keeping children out of the mills, but this was only meaningful if there were schools for them to attend. The development of a national system of elementary education was a slow process, involving church organizations, voluntary societies, and eventually the state in a complex and contested collaboration. The Education Act of 1870 established a national system of school boards with powers to build and maintain schools in areas where voluntary provision was inadequate. Board schools, as they came to be known, began to appear across the country, their red brick buildings with their tall windows and ventilated roofs a distinctive addition to the urban landscape. By the end of the Victorian period, elementary education was compulsory and free, and literacy rates had risen substantially. Children who grew up in the 1890s had access to educational opportunities that would have been extraordinary to their grandparents. The relationship between the industrial economy and the natural world was complex. The same coal that powered the factories and the railways also damaged the air quality of cities and contributed to the degradation of the waterways. The rivers that ran through industrial regions received the effluent of dye works and chemical plants, and by the middle of the Victorian period many of them were severely polluted. The smoke from coal fires and industrial processes created the characteristic fogs of the Victorian city, the thick, yellowish smogs that settled over London and the mill towns and persisted for days at a time. And yet the Victorians were not indifferent to the natural world. The passion for natural history that was widespread among educated Victorians expressed a genuine appreciation for the diversity and wonder of the living world. The great naturalists of the period, of whom Darwin is the most famous but far from the only important figure, pursued their work with an intensity that reflected deep engagement with the question of what the natural world was and how it worked. Collections of birds, insects, plants, and fossils accumulated in houses and museums across the country, the physical evidence of a culture of close observation. The seaside, which the railways had made accessible to a broad public, became a place where the natural world could be encountered in a relatively undisturbed state. Rock pools were explored by families equipped with buckets and nets, their contents studied and sometimes collected. The shore itself, with its birds and its tidal patterns, offered a counterpoint to the industrial landscapes that many visitors had left behind. The Victorian seaside holiday was partly a recuperation from the stresses of urban and industrial life, a brief contact with water and air and light unmediated by the products of industry. The agricultural regions that surrounded the growing cities were themselves changing, though more slowly and less dramatically than the urban and industrial areas. The enclosure of common land had been proceeding for centuries before the industrial period, but it accelerated during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Common land was divided and enclosed, and the rights of access that rural people had depended on were extinguished. The landscape of enclosed fields with their hedgerows and stone walls, which seems so characteristically English, is in fact a relatively recent creation, the product of this process of enclosure. The agricultural improvements of the same period, including better crop rotations, the selective breeding of livestock, and improved drainage, increased the productivity of the land. The population was growing, and feeding it required either importing more food or growing more at home. Both happened, but growing more at home required the investment of capital and the application of scientific thinking to farming in ways that were genuinely innovative. The gentlemen farmers and agricultural improvers who promoted these changes were in their own way as much agents of transformation as the industrialists and engineers. The relationship between the countryside and the city was a complex one throughout the Victorian period. The cities drew people from the countryside with the promise of wages and opportunity, but the countryside remained, for many urban dwellers, a source of nostalgic feeling and a contrast to the difficulties of city life. The pastoral ideal, the idea of a simpler, purer existence in the countryside, was a persistent presence in Victorian literature and visual art, even though the reality of rural life was often hard and poorly rewarded. Towards the end of the Victorian period, the technologies that had defined the Industrial Revolution were beginning to be supplemented by new ones. Electricity, which had been studied as a scientific phenomenon for decades, was beginning to find practical applications. The electric telegraph had been in use since the 1840s, but the generation and distribution of electricity for lighting and power was a development of the 1870s and 1880s. Thomas Edison in America and Joseph Swan in Britain both developed practical incandescent light bulbs in 1879, and the electric light gradually began to replace gas in the places where the infrastructure for its distribution could be built. The first electric power stations appeared in major cities in the early 1880s. They were expensive to build and operate, and the electricity they produced was initially available only in small areas near the generating station. But the technology improved rapidly, and the geographic reach of electric power expanded decade by decade. The transition from gas to electric lighting happened over a generation, with gas and electricity coexisting in buildings and streets for many years before electricity became dominant. The development of the internal combustion engine and the appearance of the first motor vehicles at the very end of the Victorian period pointed toward the next great transformation of transport and industry. The first automobiles were fragile and unreliable, their maintenance requiring skills that few people possessed, and they were expensive enough to be accessible only to the wealthy. But their appearance was recognized as significant, and the century that followed would be shaped as much by the internal combustion engine as the preceding century had been shaped by steam. The telephone, invented in the 1870s and in commercial use by the 1880s, began to change patterns of communication for businesses and wealthy households. Like the electric light and the motor car, it was initially an expensive luxury, and its diffusion through society was slow. But it represented another step in the compression of distance, another reduction in the time and effort required to convey information or to coordinate action across physical space. The Victorian period thus began with a world that would have been largely recognizable to someone from the 17th century, and ended with one in which the outline of modernity was clearly visible. The steam engines and railways that had been the defining technologies of the early and middle Victorian period were still present and still important, but they were being joined by electricity and petroleum, by the telephone and the automobile, by new chemical industries and new forms of industrial organization. The pace of change, which had already been remarkable by any historical standard, showed no sign of slowing. The people who lived through the long arc of this transformation experienced it as a series of specific changes, each one comprehensible and manageable in itself, the accumulation of which added up to something much larger than any individual change had seemed. They adapted as they had always adapted, finding ways to live within the new conditions, carrying forward the habits and values and social forms that still served them, and modifying or abandoning those that did not. The Industrial Revolution was not something that happened to passive recipients. It was shaped by millions of decisions and adaptations, by the preferences of consumers and the resistance of workers and the ingenuity of inventors and the ambitions of manufacturers, each one small in itself, together adding up to a transformation of the world. The slow accretion of change, the gradual shifting of what was normal and what was possible, is perhaps the most characteristic feature of the industrial period. The person who was born in an English village in 1760 and who lived to old age would have witnessed, over the course of a single lifetime, the emergence of something genuinely unprecedented. Not all of what they witnessed would have seemed good to them, and not all of it was. But the world they left behind was one that could feed and clothe and shelter more people than the world they had been born into, and it was one in which more of those people could read and communicate and travel than had ever been possible before. The coal that still smoldered in the late-night hearths of Victorian houses, warming the rooms where families slept, was the same coal that had built the world they lived in. The iron of the railways and the cotton of the mills and the gas in the lamps and the books on the shelves were all of them products of the same vast and slow and complicated process, the gradual application of human ingenuity to the material world, the patient accumulation of improvements and inventions and adaptations that together, over a century, had moved the world from one kind of place to another. And even as the night deepened over the rooftops of the Victorian city, and the fires settled into embers, and the last sounds of the day faded into quiet, that process continued, working slowly and without announcement, as it always had.